Hello and welcome. I am thrilled to be chatting once again with the most amazing Nicholas Pearson, author of Crystal Basics, Crystal Healing for the Heart, so many other amazing works. Nicholas, thank you so much for being here today.
It is my delight, my privilege, my pleasure. These are always my favorite conversations that I get to do. So thank you for having me back.
Well, the reason we're chatting today, and this is going to be I think, a pretty informal conversation, but you and I were talking on Instagram the other day about ethically sourced minerals because this is something that I think in the collective mineral community has really come to the forefront of being of great importance. We want to make sure that we're buying and sourcing gems ethically, as consumers, as people who purchase crystals, and or as business owners who are selling crystals, like both sides of that. And we were talking about a number of things, right? We discussed like what actually makes something ethical. We talked about the use of ethical as kind of a buzzword, and we decided, you threw out the great idea, like, let's have a conversation about this for the podcast and really just dig into it. So, first and foremost, I want to ask you, for those who may not know, why would it be important for us to try and source our minerals ethically?
I think as people in the kind of conscious living sphere, however we might define that, the body, mind, spirit, the wellness, we care about the impact we put into the world, most of us at least. And there's an expression, if it isn't grown, it's mined. So everything, period, has some relationship to a raw material that came from Mother Earth, whether we sowed those seeds ourselves or, leveled a forest to get something that has grown, or whether we are digging stuff out of the earth. Anywhere I look in my room around me, not just the rocks on every surface, but the surfaces themselves probably have some relationship to the mineral kingdom, whether it's the plastic drawers full of tumbled rocks, or even the fibers in the carpet beneath me are petrochemicals. So we can't have an existence that doesn't, at least this stage in our development on Earth, we can't have an existence that isn't impacted by mining and extraction. And as conscious consumers, my hope for myself, and I can only speak for my hope for me, is that the decisions I make will impact the earth as conscientiously and as least devastatingly as possible. I care about where rocks come from, not just because I care about rocks, but because I care about the people who get them out of the earth, the people who do the lapidary work, the people who bring them to market. And it's such a complex conversation. There's no one way to define or identify an ethically sourced rock. And we just have to take the information we've got and make the best decision available for us.
So, before we get into what actually does define an ethically sourced mineral, I want to kind of echo what you were just saying about, this goes so much deeper than just minerals. It really is about our existence in the world as modern humans, especially Western modern humans. This is something that we all have to the best of our ability, be conscious of the decisions that we make. It makes me think a lot about The Good Place. I don't know if
Yes.
you've ever seen that show. So it
Yes.
makes me think a lot about The Good Place, and that like things have gotten so complicated and complex in our world that every decision that we make has far reaching repercussions and ramifications. So thinking of Cheaty and the almond milk, but it's it's very much like that. I think of that with myself in, you do something as seemingly simple as purchasing blueberries at the grocery store, at the supermarket. If you do that without thinking about the migrant workers who are probably not paid fairly for that food you're consuming, if you think about organic versus conventional produce, if you think about the all the minerals that it takes to create the devices that we're all communicating on, watching this on, listening on, all of these things are, like you said, extracted from the earth, every little bit of it. And it kind of makes me think of like Alan Watts has this whole talk on how us humans live in our ticky-tacky houses with our ticky-tacky things. And as much as sometimes we feel so separate from nature, from Mother Earth, and from the world, we are a part of it. And everything we do is interconnected and interwoven. So, with that, why is it that crystals in particular have kind of this bad reputation for being particularly harmful in some circles?
Oh gosh. Well, I think a really prime example is the idea of like conflict gemstones and other conflict materials, because while this is a really horrific practice and it is something that is ongoing and there is vast corruption, and for anyone who might not be aware of what the term conflict stone or conflict gem means, these are these are materials that are bought and sold in areas that are rife with human conflict, often at the expense of human lives or through the endangerment of human lives. Miners in places who do the digging for these diamonds risk life and limb in a quite a literal sense, uh, over misplacing a stone, let alone taking one with them intentionally. So you've got these sorts of horrific human practices, social practices, that are then in turn fueling things like the sale of those gems might be encouraging the buying of firearms and munitions and other agents of war. And the conventional jewelry trade has begun to establish guidelines for navigating your way through that. You can buy certified conflict-free gemstones. Certainly not every rock out there, but the real truth behind this example in particular, that I think is going to hold true for the rest of rocks and minerals that we'll talk about, is you genuinely just can't know the entire provenance of a stone in most cases. So maybe we've heard about these conflict diamonds. Maybe we've heard about the horrible things happening with the generals in Mozambique or in Myanmar with the jade mines, or all these other places where the indigenous people are subjected to some pretty brutal atrocities in the name of gems. And we start to think about, well, I wonder what the rest of the crystal healing market is like. And a few years ago, there was this really poignant piece that came out through like conventional media outlets about kind of the dark side of the crystal healing industry. And it really focused on some of the conditions of miners in Madagascar. And the example they kept coming to time and time again was rose quartz, because that was what the journalist uncovered and followed the most. And I mean, it's pretty grim, not to sugarcoat that. But we have to remember that these are singular examples. The rock and mineral industry has been going on since the beginning of time, since the beginning of commerce, since the beginning of trade. We have evidence of gemstones being traded across great distances for huge expenses, also at the risk of life and limb, since the dawn of time. So there's nothing here that is new, but there's also nothing here that we should ignore just because it's old. And I think the growing popularity in the idea of an ethically sourced stone is because enough people have realized other sectors of the market matter. And if we want to walk our talk and be these highly evolved spiritual people, then we gotta look at our own practice, which is sometimes hard. You look at a beautiful object. I pick up this beautiful barite from Morocco, and I don't really know how it got to me. In this particular instance, I don't know who mined it, at what time of year, under what conditions, how much they were paid. But it's a lovely object that I have in my possession. It is a spiritual tool that I use for the betterment of myself and my clients and my students. And I would like to think that all of that is fine on its own, but there are still other ripples being cast by these stones. And it's time at least to have uncomfortable conversations about what those ripples look like, even if we don't have all the answers. I think it's really good to open the door.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think, one thing that you have kind of brought up a little bit that I want to harken back to is this idea that perhaps at least part of the reason this has become so important to so many of us is because it almost feels in opposition to the beliefs that many of us hold spiritually. If we believe in compassion, if we believe in non-harm, if we believe in stewarding the earth and in oneness and connection and taking care of one another as part of this human collective, then it seems that some of these atrocities obviously are in direct opposition to that. It is a painful question to examine. How can these two things coexist and fit together as part of the sphere of human experience, right? Because you don't have that beautiful barite without that. And I think realizing that ultimately, always, whenever we're talking about a case of extraction, there is a cost somewhere. There is a cost somewhere. And so let's dig into what makes a mineral ethical, because I'm going to tell you, I have a bit of a pet peeve right now with this term ethical. It's not with the term, it's with the way that the term is being used. Because I cannot tell you how many, I'm on Instagram a lot. I cannot tell you how many crystal shops pop up in my feed, and I go to their page and the first thing it says is 100% ethically sourced minerals. It is so misleading. It is so inaccurate, especially when I quite frequently see some of the stuff that's on those pages and I know where it's from and I know there's no way. So I want to know, we were talking about this a little bit, but what in your eyes classifies a mineral as ethical? What should we strive for?
So let's start with an example of something we can guarantee is entirely ethically sourced. Something that I know I have total agency over. I go to a place in nature, I find a stone, and it is a place where I am legally and morally allowed to pick up the stone. I pick it up myself, and I haven't left much of a carbon footprint. I haven't disrupted too much of the environment with my presence there, although, I've stepped on blades of grass, I've broken twigs. There are still ripples. I bring that stone home, I clean it lovingly, and I put it in my toolbox. That stone is probably as close to 100% ethically sourced as anything can be. And everything else has a bigger footprint than that, because I was listening once to an interview that Sabrina Scott, she's the author of a book called Witch Body, did. And she was talking about her vegetarianism. And the interviewer kind of made the assumption that maybe that had something to do with ethics or morals, and it was entirely like a dietary need for her. And she said, and I'll butcher this quote, but I'll paraphrase, that she said that there is nothing without violence. Even being a vegetarian, even consuming only plants, means that organisms sacrifice their lives and their well-being to feed us. So with any stone we pick up, there is some level of, maybe violence is not the word we want to use, because it would require us to anthropomorphize things that are not sentient in the same way that we are. Their spirits are different. Their quote unquote life cycles are different, but we have to disrupt something to end up with that tool. So I think when we are talking about the parameters of an ethically sourced stone in a more practical sense than only what you can pick up reasonably, we have to look at what technology and practices were used to get it out of the earth. Were we cautious and conscientious about the environment and the footprint we're leaving there? What about the conditions of the human beings operating said equipment? You can have, low invasive techniques like just gentle hand mining and digging by hand. You don't have a huge carbon footprint that way, but are those workers in safe and sound conditions? Are they dying of cave-ins? Are they, being pinned under heavy rocks? Are they coming home exhausted and unable to do anything else with their lives? Their emotional well-being is certainly a part of this. How much has the stone traveled to get to you? There is an ethics in the amount of fossil fuels it requires to ship rocks around the world, which is done every year to go from point of origin to point of lapidary work to point of distribution at trade shows until they finally make their way into retail stores and in our hands. I mean, you get something that's maybe mined somewhere in North America sent to South Africa or India or Indonesia for lapidary work, then maybe bought and sold by the barrowful in China, and then brought back into North America at trade shows like Tucson or Denver, when we could have just brought it there in the first place ourselves. But the value of human labor is so different in a white Western civilization than it is in other parts of the world. And it's hard to have this conversation about ethics without also looking at the role of like white supremacy and all these other kind of like white focused and white centered things that give us this capitalist ability to go out and buy the best rock for the best price. And I'm not condemning anyone for existing in a capitalist society and surviving and thriving even in a capitalist society, but we have to remember that those things, they enact a form of violence. There's just no way around it. And of course, is the stone being bought, sold, distributed, traded in a way that is contributing to magnifying, glorifying human conflict? Are children being forced to mine things like the mica in our jewelry? I mean, the list just goes on and on. But what is the environment? What is the role of the workers? How big is the carbon footprint? And at the end of the day, what does the marketing look like? Because there is an ethics to the marketing and the naming of stones that intentionally obfuscates a lot of these steps. So they're all factors, but there's no single checklist that says this stone was ethically sourced unless you know the entire story.
And in all honesty, 99.99% of the time, we don't. Yeah. Because like everything through capitalism, the process has been created on such a large scale now. Everything is done on such a large scale that the mineral market is huge. And like you said, you might have a crystal that could have been mined 50 miles from where you live, but it traveled 10,000 miles to get to you. Quite literally. I mean, this happens. So, and one of the other things we were discussing on Instagram is not just looking at these points that you mentioned. So the environmental impact and ethics there, the workers' conditions, are they safe? Are they healthy? The fair pay and wages for workers, was child labor used? All of these things, right? But all of those things throughout every step of the process, from the mining to the manufacturing to the sorting and transport and distribution of those minerals, every single step of the way, those questions have to be answered. And sometimes we have some of those answers and not others. And it is a difficult conversation to have, but I think it also makes us conscious of our consumption. At least I can say that for myself. I used to, I think, be a lot more apt to consumerist tendencies of just like buying what I wanted whenever I wanted, in a very white-centric Western capitalist kind of a way. And I think that having these questions to reflect on and understand that, like you said, every part of this process, there is a cost, and in some way there is going to be violence. There's going to be violence in this. And so, like, where do we go from here? How do we, as conscious consumers or as conscious business owners, as conscious healers, teachers, spiritual practitioners, how do we make the best, most sound decisions that we can when it comes to our role in this? And how important is this really, that we do this?
Yeah. I think I want to work backwards here, because there's a really good talking point, I think, about our role and how big it plays in the global market of this. Crystals are huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Rocks and minerals have been a thing for a long time. They're becoming more investable, especially in high-end specimens. And so that's something that we will only ever see increase. But the percentage of all mining and extraction that this represents is teeny tiny. It is infinitesimally small. And as a general rule of thumb, most of the industrial mining that is done for the rocks and minerals that end up on the crystal healing market are either done in fairly small yield, standard, I mean, we'll say average safety, average pay, not big extremes of this, or they are byproducts of more important commercially mining industries. Let's look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a great example, where all this beautiful malachite and shattuckite and chrysocolla and cornatite and all the other ites are coming from. The cobaltoin calcites and cobaltoin dolomites. A lot of this stuff is found in the way of what industrial mining is really trying to do, get at things like cobalt and nickel and valuable ore minerals that can be refined to extract these really valuable metals to produce the devices that you and I are communicating with, and that all of our listeners are streaming and watching and tuning in on. And I think we have to take a step back and go, okay, this device, obviously it didn't grow on a tree. So if it wasn't grown, it was mined. All the components in it are inorganic in nature. They were mined. So what kind of impact did this device have? And honestly, I can say without a doubt, my iPhone produces more violence against the earth and humankind than just about any rock in my collection. That doesn't necessarily help me sleep at night because I still own the cell phone. But when I stop and go, where is the greatest harm being done? It's not my rose quartz. It isn't that beautiful piece of barite I had. It isn't even like my really precious gems like emerald. It's in my devices. So if those miners are given the opportunity to dig all that beautiful malachite out of the way, to go in for the raw metals and ores and things that are much more important, and then we have a pile of tailings just sitting around polluting the earth, why not sell those? Why not bring them to the lapidary trade? Why not bring them to the market where these miners, who are quite honestly not getting paid what they're worth, to get the cobalt ores and the tantalum and the other great stuff? I would love to live in a world where they were in safe conditions and getting paid fairly. But the reality is they're not. If they can supplement that with the cutting, selling, polishing, distributing of malachite and other things that are right there on in situ, I want them to do that. I want to support that industry. I want to hope that part of it, that arm of it, is doing better. And there aren't a lot of people I buy malachite from, me personally, especially at the wholesale level. I go to people where I know what kind of relationship they have. My favorite malachite vendor, his family is from the Congo. He's from the Congo. When I buy rocks from him, he can tell me exactly where they came from, the name of the mine, even if the shaft has a name, or at least the relationship it's got to the geography of the area. And I understand that because he has that literal familial kinship with the people doing that labor, they're getting paid fairly. And I'll spend more to do that. So I will. But as far as what is our responsibility? Our responsibility absolutely is to improve the crystal healing market. But ultimately, that's small potatoes compared to where real mining and extraction damage is being done at the environmental and the social level. So yes, improve the mining of rose quartz, improve the mining of amethyst and malachite and barite and celestite. But let's improve the big industrial complexes that are exploiting human labor to produce the stuff we need in our devices and the stuff we need in our automobiles and the stuff we need for weapons. I mean, really, do we need to keep mining uranium and stuff? I think it is absolutely in my cards to do the best I can with my crystals that I use in my healing practice. But I also think it's in my cards to shine a light on how it's just a small piece of the puzzle.
Thank you so much for bringing this up, because I think this is something that most people don't even realize or recognize. I think that most lay people, right, think that if malachite is being sold on the mineral market, that is the goal in mind with the mining process, with everything. And 98% of what we probably have in the crystal market is, as you said, a byproduct, a seconds kind of pick through. because frankly, again, operating within capitalism, that stuff isn't where the money is. It's in
Hmm.
the ore, it's in those raw materials that go into everything else. And I think one thing that you said that is so important to recognize also, and I really want it to sink in for people, is how small the crystal and gem market is out of the whole mining industry, right? So we have all those ores and raw materials that are going into things, like you said, electronics and devices, cosmetics. We talked about quite a bit. You mentioned the mining of mica. And it, I mean, really, if you want to deep dive into this stuff, go look that up because you will likely learn a lot if you're not familiar with that already. And these are all parts of one huge global complex that is so deeply intertwined. And as Nicholas said, if we can take some of those crystals that otherwise were for a long time until people realized there was some value, right? Again, because this is capitalist driven. Often those minerals were just sitting in a heap, sitting in a pile. They were too difficult to work with. But we as humans have decided that they have value. There is value in them. So now it's part of this whole big machine that is the mining industry. And so I think it's so interesting to look at our responsibility, yes, through that lens of what we are contributing to crystal healing and to this very small niche, but in a much bigger way, through a much wider lens, and seeing all the ways that this impacts our world. And so, Nicholas, thank you so much for, I think, really breaking that down, because that is something that, I mean, even when I was into crystals, when I was a kid and a teenager, I knew about mining from reading, my Smithsonian guides and my things like that. Really understood that there is a complex relationship there. But in my mind, still for many years as a kid, I thought these things were like separate. I thought like, oh, you mine for ore and you do these things. And sometimes those things also happen to be crystals, silver and copper and things like that. But very much these two are intertwined and they can't be separated from one another. And hopefully, the more of us that are examining this, that are asking questions, that are putting pressure where we need to put pressure in this secondary mineral market, my hope is that somehow that ripple will extend into the greater practice of mining and how it's done in our world. And I don't know if that will happen, and I don't know when that will happen, or again, if, I think, is the bigger piece of that puzzle. But I'd like to think that at some point it's possible. But also, like you mentioned, Nicholas, this is such an old industry. And largely, it's been done the same way for a very long time. For a very long time. There might be new advances in technology, there might be new pockets and new uses for some of these materials. But largely, the industry as a whole, I don't think, has changed much in the thousands of years that we've been extracting minerals from the earth. So I do like what you said about, at least it's almost like we give these minerals purpose. And if there is going to be this secondary market of these minerals that have been extracted as byproducts, if we can work with them for our own growth and work with them for healing of ourselves and of others, and really examine how this fits into part of our spiritual practice, part of our way of tapping in and connecting with the earth. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it just something that exists where we, just like everything, we have to take it for what it is. There are pros and cons. There are pieces that um, are benefiting the earth and pieces that are not. I mean, what do you feel ultimately, how do I want to phrase this? What do you feel ultimately, um, because I know okay, let me say it this way. There are people watching and listening right now that are wondering, so what is the answer, right? What is the answer? So should I be working with crystals? Should I not be working with crystals? What is the right answer? And let me pose that to you, because I know I'm really going to put you on the spot. But like, and I think is there a right answer? Is the better question.
Like I said earlier, the only way I can know absolutely that the process is 100% ethical and sound is if I do it myself, or I know without a shadow of a doubt that someone is being transparent in the supply chain, and the supply chain is very short. So the counterpoint to add to this little addendum that I think is necessary is nobody should feel shame for not knowing better. Nobody should feel guilt for being an unconscious consumer, because we are mostly unconscious consumers. That's what our system is predicated upon. The less you know, the more you consume. Sometimes the more you know, the more you consume. I mean, I've never met a rock that I read about and didn't instantly want. Different kind of knowledge there, right? So, the first piece is to, I think, just be aware and share that awareness. That awareness sharing can come maybe in the form of asking questions. I get these from time to time. Anyone who follows me closely enough probably knows I help manage a metaphysical occult bookstore here in Central Florida, and I get to help with the finding of rock. It's called Avalon.
Yes.
So I do occasionally and more frequently these days get asked about, the ethics and the sourcing. And, the truth is it's complicated, like you and I have just discussed. And wherever possible, we will make the decision. Okay, well, here's this moonstone that we know was mined in Virginia. And we have lots of laws in North America, especially here in the US, that protect mining and the environment and workers' rights. And maybe they're not great laws, but they are more than you're going to find in other places. They're more diligently composed. So, given the choice between that and maybe some moonstone that all I know was it was tumbled in China, I'll choose the other stuff. I know its story. I can trace some of that. So part of it is like asking about provenance. This is something that mineral collectors, rock hounds, really care about. And like our lovey-dovey, healy-feely, airy-fairy woo-woo crowd has been less keen on, unless there's something metaphysically special about provenance. And again, saying all this without judgment. I was there too. But rocks tell stories geologically. And the more we know about the geology of where it came from, in my practice at least, the more it informs the way I use that stone. So asking the provenance question can be twofold. Well, is this quartz from Arkansas? Is this quartz from Sichuan province of China? Is it quartz from Australia? They're going to feel different. So it can be kind of thinly veiled as an innocent question any consumer might want to know, but it starts the wheels turning of like, well, do you know what kind of conditions were like to bring it to us? Like the average metaphysical shop worker, store owner, anything is going to say, I bought it at a trade show. We buy them in bulk because that's how it's sold. But if we as consumers start kind of leaning on our retailers to think about these things gently, lovingly, I would hesitate to say maybe somewhat naively, like don't pose it as, is this ethical? Because nobody knows. But if we start with a question of genuine curiosity, then they have genuine curiosity and they lean on their suppliers, genuine curiosity. And we start kind of this chain of like, people care about provenance. So we got to start talking about it. And there are lots of instances in the metaphysical world where provenance is intentionally hidden, very intentionally, either by changing the name or being vague about the origins of stuff. I love using the examples that you'll find in certain catalogs where they discuss how this material is found on a remote island in the Indian Ocean, or this can only be found on a distant island off the coast of Africa. And the truth is, if you know that they're talking about in both of these descriptions the same island, and that island is Madagascar, you can buy the same rock from someone who sells Madagascar minerals for like 1/10 of the price, maybe even less. That's part of our ethical consumption too. disclosing provenance helps everybody, because if we know something is from a place laden with conflict, maybe we'll decide whether or not we want to consume it. If we don't know that, we can't make that decision. And then the other thing is, like, there are ways we can consume minerals that don't constantly increase that footprint or those ripples. Old rock hounds sell, buy, and trade old collections. Buy things from your own backyard. In a metaphorical sense, I love North American rocks and minerals because the history of mining here is so rich and varied. And like the diversity we have in the United States of mineral species and rock formations and geological processes is like massive. Not just because, I mean, there's a large landmass involved, but like we have so many different geological environments and processes that produce such unique things. You go to like Franklin, New Jersey, and it is the world's foremost site of fluorescent minerals, maybe only rivaled by Quebec. Like just the sheer amount of weird things that only occur there and nowhere else is incredible. You move to the Southwest, you've got an entirely different kind of minerals. You go to Hiddenite, North Carolina, and you have like incredible mineral diversity. It doesn't resemble any of those other things. So by buying things that are historic, they haven't been mined recently. We're not putting new labor into the process, and we're not really increasing the carbon footprint with all the emissions from modern equipment. And it's got a story to it. I love an old rock that came from someone's collection. Even if I don't know the whole story, I get that little like yellowed label that goes with it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, someone hand wrote this label in the 1960s. When they dug it out of the earth, and it's been carried with the stone for 60 years now. How cool is that? So buying old stuff is a way that we can be relatively ethical. Doesn't mean it was ethical back then, but we're not putting additional strain on the environment or on the human factor. And of course, in the digital era, I can't tell you how many accounts I see and follow and experience on Instagram and other places of like little indie rock wrestlers going out and picking up rocks and then offering them for sale. And like, I can see what their environmental impact was. It was a hammer and a pickaxe. That was the fancy equipment they used. So, those are other ways. Looking for the small and independent stuff. Look for small batches of rocks and minerals. Of course, in the conventional jewelry trade, there are also artisanal miners that are like a really increasing trend right now. And I'm not super well versed in, we'll say, the ins and outs of all of that, but there are some really great people who are spotlighting artisanal miners and paying artisanal miners, which are nearly always indigenous people, fair, livable wages for what they're getting. I mean, their entire gemstone trade's built on it. Like Aquapraise is a great example. For the most part, the entire production is as ethical as any mining production can be. The lapidary artists in that area, at least, are getting paid what they're worth. And Yanni, the man who's brought this to market, has worked really hard against the big mining complexes to make this available in a way that supports people. So we do the best we can with the tools we've got. And the only way we get better tools is by learning. And one of the ways we do that is by asking questions. So it comes right back down to ask questions.
I love what you said about asking specifically about provenance of minerals. I too have very much found, working with an amethyst from India is different than an amethyst from Brazil, is different than an amethyst from Uruguay, is different than an amethyst from Madagascar. Like, you're going to have these differences in energy. But further, there are places that you can do research online. If you Google, I can't remember the name of the website right now, but the United States government keeps a website of places or industries, I should say, where child labor is used, and they break it out by industry. And so you can look up mining, you can look up a specific country, you can see if child labor is used in that industry in that country, and let that help inform some of your decisions about purchasing as well. If you know, for example, that quite frequently child labor is used in many Madagascar mining operations, you can consciously choose to avoid those minerals if that's, a step, an extent you're willing to go to in terms of your research. But you don't know if you don't know where your minerals came from. And so asking that question of provenance is so important. And I do want to touch on something, because you've been talking a lot about this on Instagram and on TikTok as well. Hi, Nicholas at the Luminous Pearl, about the very unethical practice of changing mineral names, not disclosing locations, or sometimes even not really disclosing what the material is, right? Just naming it something else. And anyone who's in the, if you know, you know, we're going to say that.
Right.
If you know, you know. And if you know about these mineral catalogs that frequently do this, it is a point of frustration for many reasons, right? Because like you said, sometimes this is intentionally disclosing for some reasons and sometimes for other reasons. I think quite frequently this plays into capitalism, right? Control of
Yeah.
the market of this one material, popularizing it under a name where you can then only get it from the person who owns the trademark or whatever it happens to be. But there are other reasons that people sometimes change the names of minerals, which aren't great either. And the company, we'll say, that is particularly fond of this practice of changing mineral names. I won't disclose the mineral because I'll give it away, but there is a very amazing family that works with a particular village in Asia doing some mining for a specific material. And I know the family that runs this operation that brings these minerals to market. I know about the provenance of these minerals, but they go by a different name somewhere else for, like you said, Nicholas, often 10 times what they're sold for under their real mineral name, their mineralogical name. And it's so frustrating to me because I think of how much more money could have gone in the pockets of the people who are mining those minerals, who are going through the process of bringing those minerals to market. And this is something that it's weird because I felt like maybe it was kind of dying down a little bit. I felt like there was this big spike, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago with these mineral names. And then it did kind of seem to mellow for a bit, but I think it's starting back up again. And you've been talking a lot about this and just trying to educate people on doing a little bit of research first before, if something seems really hyped up, if there's a lot of buzz about it, what are some of the things people should look for to try and educate themselves on that particular issue, this unethical practice of renaming minerals? How can we find if a mineral goes by another name?
So, first and foremost, if it sounds like metaphysical soup in its name, starbeam cosmic dustite, we'll make up an example. Yeah. If we've just slapped "ite" or "eme" to the end of a word that's like a buzzword in metaphysics, chances are that's not the mineral's actual name. A really good resource for this is mindat.org. Mineral database is what that's short for. And this is a bunch of, old school scientists who curate this thing, and they are sometimes savage about some of these metaphysical names when you type some of them in and you actually land on a page. If it's one of those things where if you know, you know, so like you can almost like read the humor between the words here. And that's a really great resource. Anytime you're not sure if you've got the name of a mineral correct, Mindat is a really great tool to use. It'll tell you if what you're typing in is a trade name, a varietal of another species, or lots of other things. Plenty of things won't show up in Mindat because they're too new or they're too woo-woo and they haven't infiltrated, we'll say, the market enough yet. But I think that once market reaches enough saturation, usually places like Mindat and other mineralogical things kind of respond.
And I have to say, to call it savage is super accurate, but also if you need to, if you ever have just a desire for some good, I won't call it gossip, but just a little bit of bashing, if you need to get a little nasty out of your system, it is a personal pure moment of joy for me to read through some of those forums
Oh,
sometimes
yes.
and watch people pick them apart. Like there is something, it's like a sick pleasure for me. I do really enjoy it.
Oh, yeah. I have a very dear friend who has been going toe to toe with these people for many years, genuinely wanting to educate herself. She's totally rooted in the metaphysical world, and she will ask these old school scientists, well, okay, so here's this trade name. I know it's not this. Here are some pictures. What can you tell me? And she can like take it like nobody's business. And I admire her willingness to do that, but also her perspicacity to look past like okay, this is not personal. This is not a personal attack. They're sick of the practice of the same way I am, but we come at it from two different angles. So let's meet in the middle. And you find that in the forums as well. And that's always exciting, but there's a lot of snark. There's always snark. So yeah, I get pleasure from that as well. So
Cool when you see people making those connections and kind of meeting halfway and having some of the old school sciencey geologist types be like, all right, I don't really get you crystal healing people with your woo over there, but I appreciate you coming at this from I know this isn't, Pleiadian ascensionite.
right.
What is it? And being able to have a really cool conversation and breaking some things down and really learning a lot.
Totally. It's like my favorite thing in the world. I can woo with the best of the woo, but I love just sitting down and talking to like mineral people who have no interest in the woo. And the funny thing is the longer I do this, the more years I get under my belt, the more mystically inclined science people are to me. They have such a profound awareness of and respect for the unknown. And at the end of the day, I think all spiritual practice leads us to the precipice of mystery and invites us to take that plunge. The tools we use, the language we frame it in is going to be different, but it is that willingness to dive into the heart of mystery that fuels our practice. And that is exactly what the scientific method is. And I have another very dear friend who is a proper geologist and a witch and druid, and she's tackling these same kinds of topics in her own way, and she's amazing. And to hear her talk about science and such, she recognizes that scientists themselves are a pretty superstitious bunch, that there's a very weird and wonderful kind of magic, we'll say, to the scientific method and equipment and everything else. But also, I don't think you can pursue any field, and any field at all. It doesn't have to be science related, without the passion and wonder that mystery evokes. And those are the same things that drive authentic spiritual practice. That willingness to be vulnerable and surrender is just marvelous. But the deal is you can't surrender to the unknown until you kind of ante up with what's known. And in this sort of renaming and reclassifying and rebranding of old rocks, it is very easy to get lost. And I think some of the best spiritual experiences I've ever had are with humble rocks, really, really ordinary things. I always have flint nearby. Here's some that I took from, oh, God knows where, somewhere. Where I was ethically allowed to, probably a gravel parking lot in Glastonbury. But there's this very ancient lineage of picking up a stone because it's charming to us and for no other reason than that personal connection. And if we can kind of recognize that our metaphysical ites are common, humble stones, then we can steep ourselves in that mystery. Also, we can probably buy them under their common, humble names for much less. And that's the part of this process that gets me. By intentionally hiding provenance, by intentionally describing the composition of things, like you're leading someone up to the list of things that make up the rock, but you're just not naming the rock. Like that's a conscious decision someone has made.
Yes.
And to get that far and stop is to pull the wool over someone's eyes. And the internet broke me one day when I saw a polished sphere of the most ubiquitous metamorphic rock in existence being sold for thousands of dollars, a 4-inch sphere. And like that was just, it wasn't that long ago. It was actually the start of these videos. And just like something snapped and it was like, this has always bothered me, but like if this 4-inch sphere is worth this much money, then how much is a countertop worth made out of the same material? You could go and per square yard pay like 150, maybe $300 for really high-end material of the same stuff. Maybe not from the same place, but it's the same stuff. So,
and literally get a ton, like a literal ton of the material for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go visit your local shopping mall. What are those tiles made out of that you're walking all over? If it has columns or a facade, what is that? I once had a bank when I lived in a small town in Central Florida. The front of it was made out of larvacite.
I was going to say, we have a building in Madison. The front is made of larvacite, and it's so beautiful.
Right. Common rocks. I mean, this is just an igneous rock. It's a cyanite. It's not like, groundbreaking stuff. I mean, as metaphysical people, we appreciate a different kind of value in it. But imagine now that building material, that architectural material has an inherent value, and that's reflected by the trade and fluctuations in availability and demand. Now, what if someone else comes along and says, I really like this stuff, but it's not moving as larvacite. I'm going to name it, galactic blue spaceshipite. And instead of, $150 for a slab of it that's 3 feet by 3 feet, it's $150 for a piece the size of my fist. It's the same stone. It offers the same benefits. It's probably even dug out by the same human beings at the same time. But the artificial inflation of price is really detrimental, and the ripples that causes are problematic. Not every trade name is bad. Angelite is a really great example. If you go buy blue, compact, anhydrite as angelite, it's actually cheaper than the beautiful crystalline specimens of angelite you get from other parts of the world. So value and trade name are not always inherently linked, but it's the practice around it. Nobody's trying to.
Also a difference, right? And I want to distinguish this between a trade name and a trademarked name.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is a big part of this issue.
And a colleague of mine once went down the rabbit hole with a lot of these trademarked names. She actually wrote a little booklet that you can find on Amazon. If that's appropriate, I can share. It's called Old Rocks, New Names by Christy Huggs. She actually, she looked at databases with the US trademark database, Canadian Intellectual Property Office database, and similar databases in the UK and Australia for a lot of these trademarked names. And she found that in more cases than not, the trademark was being used, the symbol was being used without the paperwork having been filed. So they're not even legally trademarked in some cases, which is a whole new kind of work.
About 10 years ago, I did the same thing for one specific mineral that I was very curious about. And I actually found the trademark filings with the trademark office, but it was marked as like a dead trademark because no one ever followed through on the filing. So although it had been initially registered, probably to keep other people from using it at the time that this particular mineral was really blowing up, which was, like I said, about 10 years ago, there was never a follow through on that. But I still see the initial filers of this using the TM after the name all the time. So that's very interesting too. And, one thing that I love that you said that I just want everyone to really think about, I really want this to sink in, is just the beauty in the common rocks that are around us. Because I think so often we get hung up on these things that, let's face it, are exquisitely beautiful, right? Are stunningly beautiful. For thousands of years, humans have been attracted by these amazingly colored things that are made by the earth. They still amaze me when I'm like, I can't believe the earth made this. It's, there's something awe-inspiring about that. But there's also beauty and also healing and also connection to be found in the stones around us. And how many of us can connect or think back to our first experience of maybe being a child and going for a walk and being enamored with a rock. And maybe it was a piece of parking lot gravel. Maybe it was a
Yep.
landscaping rock. Maybe it was a smooth stone that you found in a stream. But I think all of us who love rocks now in our adulthood have at least one vivid experience like that, where we were just as taken with something we found maybe literally in our own backyard.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
thank you for saying that, because I think we forget sometimes.
we do. We put things on pedestals that we view as exotic and other and different, and we take for granted our everyday scenery. But if we can look at the world through the beginner's mind, through the eyes of a child with the heart of innocence, what part of our existence isn't magical? I mean, like, we're talking to each other on screens with signals that float through the air and permeate all these things between us, on a rock floating in space, orbiting a giant ball of gas in the sky. Like, seriously, life is magical. I don't need a mysteryite to enhance the mystery. Like, I can pick up an ordinary rock and have that experience, but it's it's the recognition of the otherness, the inherent sanctity of everything. And it's so easy to exoticize, and that's rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in the sort of racial and social injustices that we're seeing in the world. But like, what about where you are right now? I guarantee there is rock underneath just about everyone's feet. If you're listening from the space station, I'm really sorry. Next time, bring rocks with you so you can be part of this. But seriously, like, no part of our existence can be divorced from the geosphere, from the part of the earth that is geological in nature. And so many of our everyday resources are derived from it. And when we recognize the profundity of that, holy cow, like, everything is crystalline. We're at least a couple degrees of separation removed from all things crystalline. That to me opens new doors to my everyday practice. And it's like the picking up of the humble stone and going, all right, what is your lesson for me? What can we do together? What do you need from me?
Mm.
Not always, what can I get from this, but what can I give in this situation? And those are the kinds of questions that also make our practice more compassionate, that make us more willing to have the empathy and the sensitivity to make better buying decisions. I mean, sometimes the best buying decision is like, I see crystals in a store, I'm like, I have to rescue you. I really have to. I hear you. And other days it's going, if I buy this thing in this consumer environment, it's going to tell capitalism to put more of these things here. And I know without a doubt what kind of practices brought them. So I'm not buying this from a big box store. I'm not buying this in the mall. I'm not doing this. That's me. No guilt, shame, or blame for anyone else who's making a different decision. I I control my own. So again, I don't want to have this conversation make people feel guilty for owning rocks. Like, please don't. Work with them. Work with the tools you've got. Make new friends along the way. It's such a complicated conversation. There's so much depth to this. And you have to have courage. You have to be brave enough to be uncomfortable to do this work. And it's related to so much of the other work being done in the world. And it matters. We all matter. You matter. And your decisions matter. And small though they might feel, it does make a difference.
Wow, so powerful, Nicholas. And on so many levels, everything that you've said today, I think, is going to take hours and days and months to kind of ripple through each of us engaging in this dialogue and listening in on this conversation and realizing how many layers there are to this work, and realizing that, there's our individual actions, there's our collective actions, there's the contribution to extraction, to consumerism, capitalism, white supremacy, all of these things that are hopefully quite literally being torn down, reconstructed, reimagined. And it does start with each of us. It does start with each of us. And I so appreciate the open discussion without blame, shame, nothing, just an open discussion and an opportunity for reflection and an opportunity for making the best decisions we each can, the best choices we each can. And I just thank you. I thank you so much. And, I always learn so much from our conversations. You are my absolute favorite person to talk to
Oh,
about crystals. um,
likewise.
quite honestly, because I feel like we always get to go a little bit deeper. We always get to kind of break things down and look at these layers. And you have so many great opportunities for learning. I mentioned a few of your books earlier. I highly recommend all of Nicholas's books. They're all on my bookshelf right there. Seriously, so fantastic. If you want more of this kind of an opportunity to think about the mineral kingdom, then I highly recommend reading Nicholas's books. But Nicholas, you also teach some great classes. I know you just recently did a class about the barrels,
Mhm.
particularly with a focus on emerald, which I know is one of your favorites. But you have another class coming up. When this airs, it should be in just a day or two. So I
Mhm.
believe it's June 10th, right?
Yes, I have a class called Gems of Abundance. It's all about crystals for wealth, success, and sovereignty. And, more than just the capitalist definitions of those things, like finding way to have agency and support and defining success on your terms. So that'll be the evening of June 10th. Recordings will be available for anyone who can't make it live. I do have a couple of ongoing monthly things that I do every month. So there's a free Reiki share that I'll do. My next one will be June 12th. And then I have my next installment in the Monolith series. Right after Beryl, the next one is going to be Agate, which is a very mercurial stone and very common, very humble. I myself just got some new agate from Utah that I'm excited to sit down and talk to or listen to, as the case is probably going to be. And yeah, it's so much fun getting together in these digital spaces. So I'm grateful that one of the blessings of COVID has been a new kind of connection. Low overhead. I don't have to pack up rocks and fly with them. Rocks are heavy. Airlines are the worst. So we've also lowered our carbon footprint. There we go. See, ethical decisions, because I can do this from the comfort of my home. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. And as always, thank you for having me here.
Yeah. And tell us, Nicholas, where can people go to learn more about that class or register for any of your upcoming events?
So probably the most reliable place, visit me on social media. There'll be a link in my profile, a link tree that'll take you to all of those things individually. Um, I endeavor to have individual events listed on Facebook as well. So if you're a Facebooker, you can do that. And I do have a website, which is in need of a serious overhaul, but it's www.theluminouspearl.com. And if you don't see what you're looking for there, you can just shoot me a message via the contact form and I'll send anyone who wants individual links. But I'll make sure those are up and about for everyone.
And we will, of course, have links to all of those places that you can stay connected with Nicholas over on the website at loveandlightschool.com/blog. And again, Nicholas, thank you so much for the conversation, for the companionship. It was great chatting with you today.
Thank you.